Welcome to another episode of Off the Menu. I'm Vincent Franchini from Tumblr House, here with the great Charles Coulombe.
Basking in my own, what was the most recent thing? Laid back-inness.
Laid back in this?
Laid back-inness.
Oh, laid back in this. Yeah,
Laid back-inness.
very laid back. A little too laid back for some people.
That's what I was accused of. But I have a right to be laid back today.
Why is that?
Today is two things. Well, three things, really. It's the Feast of St. Thomas of Villanova. It is the Feast of St. Maurice of the Thundering Legion for all of you Catholic militants out there. And it is the autumn solstice, the beginning of autumn. And it's actually beginning to feel like autumn around here. But, having said all of that, it's a good time to be laid back and, maybe get a pumpkin latte and sit back by the fire and sort of relax. Isn't that great? Will that be nice to do?
Yeah, I think.
All right. So what's wrong with being laid back under those circumstances?
I don't know. What?
I don't know. I mean, I'm not the one who said it. The same person, we're not reading the note, but the same person also complained that I did not deliver the information as I did 20 years ago. Well, there are two reasons for that, really. One is that I'm 20 years older. The second is, and this is a bit of advice to all you folks out there who want to stay in the fight a long time. When you're young, you're filled with fire and zeal, which you should be, or you'd accomplish absolutely nothing. But there comes a time you got to learn to pace yourself if you want to keep going and not give in to bitterness or cynicism. And one hopes that with time, you also begin to acquire a certain amount of the peace that surpasseth all understanding. When you're young, you need that fire as long as it isn't bitter. As you get older, you need to bear in mind that if you do get angry, if you do upset your peace of soul, the enemy has won a small victory over you. But if he can't shake you, if he can't upset you, if he can't annoy you beyond a certain surface area, he's lost. So, other than that, I don't know what to say. So let's move on.
Okay. Edward W. With a question for you. He says, I heard that in parts of Croatia, the traditional Latin Mass was allowed to be offered in Old Slavonic. Why is Old Slavonic a liturgical language? Is this Mass still offered today? If not, has anybody tried to revive it?
Okay, those are all good questions. Well, to answer the first one, yes, it was the Latin Rite was offered in Old Church Slavonic, just like the Byzantine Rite. Oddly enough, in a strange alphabet called, are you ready? Glagolitic, which was the precursor to the Cyrillic alphabet that most Slavic languages are written in. Why is Old Slavonic permitted as a liturgical language? Because of its use by St. Cyril and Methodius, who are co-patrons of Europe, and the fathers, really, of the Slavonic Byzantine Rite, as we know it. They were missionaries. They came from Constantinople, they went to Rome, and they worked with the collaboration of both the Holy See and the Patriarchate of Constantinople to evangelize the Slavs. So, they made Church Slavonic a liturgical language like Latin, like the Koine Greek, which is used by the Byzantine Rite in Greece and Syria and so on. Interestingly enough, like Latin, like Koine Greek, Old Slavonic is no longer comprehensible to modern Slavic speakers. Now the second question was, why is this permitted? Well, it was permitted, as I say, Cyril and Methodius. The third was, is this done today, and if not, other attempts to revive it? Good question, and the answer is no and yes. In the sense that 50 years ago, like so many wonderful things in the church, so many local rites, the clerics of the day destroyed them. But, as we know, life goes on. Woodstock in the 60s recede ever further into the past. And just in recent years, although in the country of Croatia, which is where this was done, there are no regular diocesan Latin masses at all yet. They are beginning to have them now and then, thanks to the sterling work of Una Voce Croatia and other organizations like that. And just this past year, they've had a few glagolitic masses as well. The fact that there are younger priests interested and younger laymen interested, I think is a pretty good indication that in another 50 years, there'll be a lot more of them than there are now. And of course, the old priests will be doubtless spitting in their graves, like tops.
Okay.
Too bad.
Edward W. has a second question. In the history of the traditional Latin Mass, has the Holy See allowed the Mass to be changed from Latin to a local language?
A couple of rare occasions, yes. This was most recent. It was also the 50s. They allowed the ordinary of the Mass, the major prayers, in other words, the Agnus Dei, the sung parts, the Agnus Dei, the Sanctus, and all that, to be translated into Luba, which is a Congolese language in the Congo in Africa.
Oh, okay.
And the result was the Missa Luba. Actually, you know what? I'm wrong. The Missa Luba wasn't Latin. It's just that the music was Luba. I can't really think of any other than the Glagolitic, but that come to mind. But I do think there are one or two other examples. But I may be wrong. It's very, very small, if any, other than the one we just mentioned.
Okay. Next question is from the DT Corey. Have you ever used the green scapular? And if so, have you ever had any success with the scapular?
Yes and yes. Next. Oh, you want specifics. The green scapular is used primarily to bring about conversions. And it's unusual in that it doesn't need a special blessing. And anyone can wear it and get the benefits thereof, not just Catholics. Not only that, it doesn't even have to be worn to exercise its power. If you leave a green scapular in the house of somebody you're keen on converting, it can have a certain power.
That's amazing.
Isn't it?
I think I feel like gifting green scapulars to like all my fallen away friends.
Yeah, and your and the pastor, sure.
Yeah, him too. Okay.
Yeah. No, seriously, it's a good idea.
Well, I don't know if I should say this, but
Then do. Or do.
the pastor of our church, one of our friends said she was trying to get enrolled in the brown scapular,
Yeah.
and he called it a superstition. And so he didn't do it.
Then he does do the green scapular.
Yeah, then he does. Yeah,
Slip
I'm going to send it to him.
Slip into the rectory, and I wonder if his own death will be a superstition. Perhaps he thinks that he's actually going to live forever. Ladies and gentlemen, just a moment ago, I said one has to avoid getting angry if one can when you're my age. But this is the kind of thing that really drives me crazy.
It's frustrating.
Well, the poor fellow. Maybe it's the early senility again. Let's hope.
It could be.
What else we got?
Okay, Eric Allen has two questions for you. His first question is, what do you think of Rod Dreher's Benedict Option, which is a popular book?
Well, I haven't read it. I have read summaries and this and that. And since I haven't read it, I'm going to preface my remarks by saying that what I'm about to say about it may be false.
Okay.
All right, it's very important to understand that. But if I'm correct, he advocates, looking at the foundation of monasteries by St. Benedict of Nursia, as back in the 500s as a way of withdrawing from the ruin of Roman social life. He advocates this as a particular strategy for Catholics in our day, pulling aside from the mainstream and forming little settlements. I may be oversimplifying, and everything I'm going to say is based about this is based upon the fact that I may not know what I'm talking about. So, if you've read the book and I'm wrong, you let us know, because I don't want to spread misinformation. If I am wrong, however, this is a point of view, withdrawing from the world and getting away from the badness, that Catholics have really been attracted to, and not just now. The noble but sad ending Mary Crest movement was like this. The people that gave us Integrity magazine, which is a great magazine, by the way. They were wonderful people, but it failed. Why did it fail? Well, there are two ways of withdrawing from the world. One is withdrawing from the world in order to focus on praying for it, and your own salvation, of course, and working toward its conversion, even if that means never leaving the monastery. Remember, Saint Therese of Lisieux considered all her work being in support of the missionaries and all that who were working in the world. So if you think of these monasteries as places that withdrew for the purpose of rebuilding and going back out, that's fine. It was the Benedictine monasteries that converted huge stretches of Europe. But if the idea is we're just going to withdraw from the badness and be safe amongst ourselves, that will fail. Most immediately, because that's not what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to evangelize the world. And secondly, and on a much more pragmatic note, because your children will not have the same drive that you do. They will not understand why you pulled away from a corrupt and horrible regime of which they have no experience. And the malcontents amongst them, and that's the vast majority of kids with any spirit in their adolescence, will be seduced by it once again, and your efforts will go to naught.
Yeah, well, the thing that comes to my mind, one of the reasons which would make this attractive to me is it's easier to exhibit fellowship, because we're so scattered. It seems like so many of us have to rely on the internet for fellowship.
It is, but you notice something funny about that very thing?
What?
The need for that fellowship has never been greater, and the ability to actually do it via the internet has never before been available.
Interesting. Okay.
I'm not saying that the internet is a good substitute for fellowship. I'm not. But the fact remains that people with our sorts of views, when I was young, letters were about it and phone calls.
Right.
You just didn't have the same immediacy, and you couldn't find each other the way you can now.
Yeah.
So what I'm suggesting is that in God's providence, as the situation has gotten worse, our ability to find one another has gotten easier.
Okay.
And I see the hand of God in that.
That's true. That's very true.
I hate to quote Lord of the Rings, but as Tolkien has Gandalf say to one of the characters, don't tell me you disbelieve in prophecy just because you had a part in bringing it about.
Ah, wow. Great line.
So don't tell me you disbelieve in divine providence just because you've been held up by it.
Wow.
And assisted by it. I mean, look at all the things we can do now that you have access to all the world's Catholic writing, at least everything that's in the public domain. If you have to translate it into Googleese, that's not as good as being able to read it in French or Spanish or German or whatever, but it's an awful lot better than nothing. I mean, really, and this is something we tend to take for granted, but the ability for like-minded Catholics from New Zealand and South Africa and India and the Netherlands and Canada and everywhere to be in touch immediately in real time is amazing. I can offer my best friend in Germany advice on how to deal with his bishop.
Right.
And vice versa. And in real time, as in, this isn't him, but, I've got the pastor on the phone, and he's saying this and such. Any suggestions?
Wow.
Then you text right back, this is amazing! And don't think it didn't come through God's will. This podcasting, ladies and gentlemen, the fact that so many of you have grown up with it reduces the miraculous nature of it for you. But I am telling you, when I was your age, the only way you and I would be having this time together is if I were on a major network. Think about that, or at least a local station.
Yeah.
You know, I'd have to be on the Carol Burnett show, which is very unlikely, by the way. Although I was a big fan of Carol Burnett, just saying that.
Mm-hmm.
I was.
I believe you.
I still am. I love to watch the old ones.
I know.
All right. Anyway, the fact remains, and the Twilight Zone also.
Of course.
All right. Thing is that this itself is part of the working out of God's will.
Mm-hmm.
And that's important to bear in mind. It's not a substitute for real connections, not by any means. But it's so much better than nothing.
Right.
And the cross-pollinization, the ability to get in touch and be in touch with Catholics of totally foreign cultures and countries and so on, what an amazing thing. And we have an obligation to make use of it. I would say, and this is something a lot of you guys out there are doing, and God bless you for it, mastery of the new technology and using it to God's ends and to spread the faith. That's where the future lies. I mean, if you can set up some sort of a deal where you've got a group of people together and they're doing this and they're reaching out to the greater world, that's great. Absolutely go with it. But if you're thinking about retreating to some safe space, where all you have to do is lock the gates and the bad guys will be on the other side and the saints will be on the inside, ain't happening. Never has, never will. And that's certainly not what St. Benedict had in mind.
Okay. I must admit the Benedict option, it does look like a very it's been on my wish list for a while, and we are selling it at TumblerHouse.com. Believe it or not, we do sell non-Tumbler House books. TumblerHouse.com. We have like 750 of them, and we do offer competitive prices and free shipping on orders over $25.
For all you distributors out there, you know what that means.
Yeah. Okay, Eric Allen's second question. What do you see as the best way for Catholics to transform society? Or should that even be a goal?
Yes, because in this case, transforming society means evangelizing it. You see, and it's that the use of that word I want to touch on.
Transform?
Yeah. And this, by the way, who's it again? EW?
Eric Allen?
Eric Allen. Eric, what I'm about to say is not a criticism of your use of it. All right? What I'm about to say, but it's interesting to note. You may have noticed that you have all of these orders of nuns and brothers and priests out there that were dedicated to evangelizing, either through education or through direct work in the missions or whatever, and they don't do that anymore. They're into social justice or ecology or Eastern mysticism or Toe contemplation or whatever they're into. Well, you may wonder how they'll constantly be babbling about their founders, and yet what they're doing is totally alien to what the founders pushed. How do you reconcile those two? With many of them in English, but I've read a lot of their websites, so I know.
Okay.
They reinterpret evangelizing the world, which their founder inevitably would have spoken of, into transforming it.
Wow, that's very slippery.
It's very slippery, because if you're trying to evangelize, what do you say? You're trying to make people Catholic. That's pretty simple. If you're transforming the world, that could mean anything you want it to mean.
Oh man, I don't like that at all. Good catch on that one.
Well, you got to read a lot of this stuff. It's amazing in life how, if you read a lot of the same sorts of things, patterns begin to emerge. But you got to be ready for a lot of boredom.
Whew.
Anyway, so I mentioned this not, again, Eric, it's not a slap at you, but it's an interesting use of language. Now, should transforming the world be what we're out to do? Transforming the world is a byproduct of evangelizing it. To go back to St. Benedict for a minute, what was he really interested in? The salvation of souls, primarily his own and those of his brethren, through prayer and work. And those, as a very natural outgrowth of what they were doing, they evangelized the areas around them. And in the end, they transformed Europe. But transformation of the environment was not what they set out to do. It was a byproduct. They didn't set out to save Western civilization, but it was a byproduct. The church's beautiful music and artwork and architecture, all these things, which are very important to preserve and maintain and extend. Absolutely, positively, absolutely. You bet. But it's a byproduct.
Yeah.
It was not the goal.
Right.
It's a byproduct. So, evangelize the world, and the world will transform.
Well, okay, well that begs the question, what's the best way to evangelize? Just person to person? How do
Well,
you do that?
It depends on you and where you are. The first thing you've got to bear in mind is that you personally have an obligation to evangelize. That's the first thing. When you've put that first in mind, then, and you pray to the Holy Ghost for help in doing so, by the way, because you've got to pray a lot for this. One of the things, ladies and gentlemen, we forget, a word to be said about prayer. I used to think when I was younger, and even more full of myself than I am now. Of course, I had a lot less self to be full of. I'm much fatter, as you know. Anyway, back then, I often thought, if I could just talk to the Pope, or just talk to the President, or just talk to the Queen or the Prince of Wales.
That's how I think.
If I could just get through to them and explain things to them.
Right.
Then everything would be better.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's how I thought. What I've tended to forget, and am a bit more conscious of now, though I still tend to forget it, is that above them all is God Himself. And through prayer, I've got the ability to talk directly to Him. I don't have to go through a ton of press secretaries and vetters and this and that. I can bring my concerns directly to the big guy.
Wow.
Who's actually more important than the Pope, the President, the Prince of Wales, and the Queen combined.
So you're saying praying for a certain person is more effective than talking to them face to face?
It sure can be. And if you don't pray for them, talking to them face to face will be useless.
Ooh.
And that's true even of your friends. So like, let's say your friend's going to, shack up with his girlfriend.
Okay.
And you're going to have dinner with him to try to talk him out of it. Well, the likelihood is you're going to fail.
Right.
Because what's motivating him is stronger than anything you've got to say. I won't be crude, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Now, that having been said, first thing you got to do is pray to the Holy Ghost. Both that His will be malleable toward the truth, and that you say and do all the right things. The sad part is that if he goes ahead and does what he says anyway, you'll never know really if he did or said the right thing.
Mm.
But what you've got to bear in mind in that setup is that in any case, his will is a determining factor, not your eloquence.
I see.
You can be as eloquent as you like, make all the right, sensible things.
Yeah.
But if he's bound and determined on something.
Well, that's a relief, because I always, being a business guy, I always had the salesman approach, right? If only I could say the right words.
But even the salesman knows that when the client goes irrational, you're done.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you're trying to sell me on the new Beaujolais and how wonderful it is, the new Beaujolais wine,
Yeah.
and how this year is the best for 30 years, and you're going on and on, and I say to you, yeah, well, my dad was a drunk and he ruined our lives. Well,
Right.
The client has gone irrational. There's nothing you can say or do except pack up your little box of wines and go bye-bye.
Yeah.
Don't waste your time with me. Find someone who's not nuts, or at least severely damaged emotionally.
Oh, yeah.
So that's my advice. I mean, you've got to bear this in mind when you're evangelizing. But to go back to the main question, bear in mind that prayer is extremely important if you want to evangelize. Don't forget it. It's the old saying is, you've got to pray as though everything depended on God, and work as though everything depended on you.
Yes.
Unfortunately, in real life, we tend to reverse it. We pray as though everything depended on us, And we work as though everything depended on God.
Yeah.
But we've got to try to overcome that particular temptation. And then look around you. Look at where you work, who you know, what your interests are. And believe me, all sorts of opportunities to evangelize will suggest themselves to you. Because each of us are in a unique situation to evangelize, depending on our interests, you know. Are you a coin collector? Well, you might make a particular study of Vatican coins or of coins from Catholic countries or something. You can work in that. You can work in your interest in the faith. And of course, one of the things, and I've said this before on the show, and I'll say it again until I drop dead, one of the things that our Jewish friends have down is inviting Gentiles to things like bar mitzvahs and things like that. Now, they do it because they're very social and they like their friends, which is great. I mean, you should be social, you should like your friends. But, you shouldn't hate them anyway. But, we'd fail to realize that when we're having confirmation parties or baptismal parties or anything like that, and we should have those, by the way, in case you thought, oh yeah, the kid's getting confirmed, that's it. No, have a confirmation party. You'll have a graduation party, there's no question about that, so why not a confirmation party? And be sure to invite your non-Catholic friends. Because then, of course, you've got to explain what confirmation is. Same with a baptismal party. And there are a lot of ways you can work it. I mean, you can have a party to honor your kid's godparents. And invite all sorts of people to that.
Okay.
So, look at where you are. It's a one-by-one deal. I mean, no, you're probably not going to baptize an entire nation. Yeah, I know. But you could try to reach the people around you.
Okay. Have you ever done any? Have you ever sent like a Catholic Christmas card to perhaps a Jewish friend?
Always.
Always. Some people they don't like that.
Well, look, I never mind getting Hanukkah cards, and I always thank the ones who send them.
Okay. Do you ever get any feedback? Has anyone ever resented? No.
No. You know, in the immortal words of Evan Syatt, who's a practicing Jew and a comedian, I remember I was watching him one day, funny man, and it was before Christmas.
Yeah.
But he gets up and he says, "To all my Christian friends, Merry Christmas. And to all my Jewish friends, Merry Christmas." And everyone, looked, because this was in Hollywood.
Right.
And he says, "Listen, take it from me. If someone is offended because you hope they're going to have a pleasant 25th of December, they're morons!" And that's the thing. I mean, we're wishing that they have that everyone, Catholic, Jewish, Presbyterian, priest, or whatever, we're hoping that whatever religion they belong to, that they have a Merry Christmas. But what does Christmas mean to us? Well, it means the Christ child. It doesn't mean Santa. I'm not saying you shouldn't have Santa visit your kids. That's not what I'm saying. But we don't celebrate Christmas because of Santa. We don't celebrate Christmas because of Rudolph. We don't celebrate Christmas for these other reasons. Not against them. Feel free to employ them to whichever way your family does. But that's not what our Christmas card should say.
What's that other from a Jewish friend of yours who talked about the majority religion? Yeah, well, I love that one.
Wasn't a friend of mine. It was Jackie Mason.
Jackie Mason. Okay,
another great comedian.
I love his quote.
Yeah, it's one of one. He started this group we call Jews for Christmas.
Yeah.
Now, he has a very thick accent, ladies and gentlemen, in case you think I'm making fun of him. And he makes fun of his own accent, so I feel entitled. But he says, he was asked about his Jews for Christmas. He says, well, they are the majority. Maybe they should have a holiday of their own. What do you think, huh? Maybe we should let them have one. So, he's hysterical.
I love him.
And an ordained rabbi.
Really?
Yes, absolutely.
Wow.
So.
Okay.
let that be a lesson to all of you out there. I don't know what, but let it be a lesson. What else we got?
Okay. Clay asks, are you familiar with the medieval folklore figure of the Friar Rush, who is the devil in disguise? Why does it seem that the medievals were comfortable with the possibility of religious orders being infiltrated by something, while in modern times it's the stuff of tinfoil hats?
Well, first we've got to tell the audience who Friar Rush was. He taught at my high school. No. Although you would have thought so from some of the characters that taught at my high school. Friar Rush is an old story from the Middle Ages, German and English. The idea is that in a given monastery, this demon enters the monastery in disguise as Friar Rush. And Friar Rush immediately begins corrupting the monastery. He arranges for ladies of ill repute to visit the abbot and the monks. He is on the verge of being found out by the holiest monk in the bunch, who is the kitchener, the cook. And of course that also is kind of a play on something, because people in those days always made fun of the religious for eating well. And so the idea was that the most corrupt monk in the monastery would be the guy that ran the kitchen.
Okay.
But in the Friar Rush stories, it's just the opposite. He's actually the holiest of the bunch.
Okay.
Which, again, is a way of poking fun at people's presuppositions.
Yeah.
You know, because people would think in those days, oh, well, yeah, the friar that runs the kitchen, ha ha ha. Except in the Friar Rush stories, they turn the whole thing on its ear. And he's the holy one.
Yeah.
So he recognizes the demon, nobody else does.
Okay.
So Friar Rush grabs him and throws him in his own cauldron and boils him to death, and then takes his place.
Oh, no.
And disguises himself as
the cook.
And so this goes on for some years. He makes much better food than the old cook did, but he causes all kinds of division amongst the monks. Eventually they get a new abbot, and the new abbot recognizes him.
Okay.
So he banishes him from the monastery. And he in turn flees to England and possesses the daughter of the queen and the king, the princess. So I forget exactly how it works, but they figure out where this thing had come from. And so they send for the abbot from that monastery, and he goes to England and he exorcises him and chases him off. So, the monastery being Germany. So that's the story of Friar Rush.
Oh, okay.
Now, what was the second question again?
Why were the medievals so comfortable with the possibility of religious orders being infiltrated, while in modern times it's the stuff of tinfoil hats?
Because they were realistic and we're stupid. Because they really held the faith and we don't.
Well, nowadays we're uncomfortable with the idea of people being possessed in general.
Yeah.
That doesn't happen.
Yeah, of course not. Which is exactly what the devil wants. The devil's, and from Samuel Johnson to God knows how many others, people have said the devil's greatest strength in these days is to convince us he doesn't exist. And of course he does. But whereas in the days of Friar Rush, you had to send a demon to pretend to be a monk, he has plenty of religious and laymen willing to do his work within the church without any need to send a demon in disguise. But yeah, they were. When you say they were comfortable with it, well, of course they didn't think it was a good thing, but they certainly knew that it was possible. And again, as I say, the funny thing about the story of Friar Rush is that it's the cook who figures out the deal. And that, again, the medievals had a sort of prejudice toward the cook and the cellarer and people like that in monasteries. And having him be the holy one, it's very funny. Anyway.
Let's talk more about this. So, monks ate well in monasteries?
Some of them. I mean, it depended. You see, the thing is, remember, when we talk about the Middle Ages, we're talking about a period of about 1,000 years.
Okay.
So about 500 to 1,500, roughly.
Okay.
So in that time, things went up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down. The church had periods of strength, periods of weakness, periods of fervor, periods of laxity. The same was true with every religious order, the same was true with every monastery. You read the history of single monasteries, you'll see that they had abbots who were very strong, and periods when they kept the rule very, very strictly, and others when it was kind of laissez-faire, and everybody had a good time, and other periods when perhaps they were downright immoral.
Okay.
These being the three states of religious life.
Right.
Strict and fervent, happy and jolly, and pretty loserish.
Loserish. Okay.
Loserish. So those are the three stages. And very often, if a monastery survived, they would get a reforming abbot who would pull things together and return to their first spirit of fervor. That's why the Carthusians, for instance, referring to this ongoing process, their great motto about themselves is never reformed because never deformed.
Ooh, I like that one.
Yeah, they do too. That's why they say it. But the sad truth of the matter is that human nature is human nature. Give it a chance to stray, and it usually will. So, and the medievals understood that. They were a very understanding bunch. And of course, then as now, from time to time, this sin or that sin would be preponderant in that place or this place. And then, if you're reading some of the sermons from that time, from the Middle Ages, why it is that a priest might go railing on and on and on about this particular sin or that particular sin. Probably because that's what was the most prominent sin at that place at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, if you read it, you think that simony is the worst sin, or sodomy is the worst sin, or adultery is the worst sin, or gluttony is the worst sin. Well, only because at that time there were a lot of simoniacs, sodomites, adulterers, or gluttons.
Mm-hmm.
You have to keep it in balance with everything else. But that's why.
Okay. Still didn't explain why there's a stereotype that monks eat well.
Oh, well, because they don't have anything else to do. And if you've got
not pray, or...
Well, yeah, but if you stop praying rigorously, if you stop observing the rule to within an inch of your life, what do you got left to do? If you're not having women smuggled in. You got to find... Look, who developed all of our great liqueurs? Benedictine, Chartreuse, while we're mentioning the Carthusians. Fra Angelico.
Really?
Fra Angelico.
Wow.
The hazelnut liqueur, yeah. Think of all the vineyards. Who invented champagne but a Benedictine monk? Dom Perignon.
Okay.
And mind you, there's nothing wrong with their appreciating the finer things.
Uh-huh.
But they got a reputation for, being very much into it. So the idea was that whoever ran either the wine cellar was surely going to be a drunk. And whoever ran the kitchen was going to be a glutton. So in a lot of medieval folklore and folk painting, the cellarer or the cook would be this enormous behemoth, who's always sampling everything. And, again, that was sometimes true, but it was certainly a big temptation. And that's why it was that way. So, again, this gets turned on its head with Friar Rush. We've got the scrawny cook who, who barely eats anything. And that also explains, though, why the cooking improved so much after he was replaced. Because he wasn't, he may have been a very holy cook, but apparently wasn't a very great one.
Ah. Okay.
Wow, Friar Rush's cooking has really improved. Yeah, it has.
Okay, next question is from Theo Weeth.
Okay.
What is your opinion on the new rite of holy orders and the new sacraments?
That is a very good question, and I do have one. Next? No. I'll tell you what I think. Well, firstly, I presume that the real question there is, are they valid?
Right.
I presume that's the question.
This gentleman has stated he's a sedevacantist.
No, then I definitely presume that that's the question.
Yeah.
as opposed to are they nice, are they pretty, etc. Now, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. Now, I've had occasion to mention before, and I have now written in my, is this a plug? My book coming out from 10 next month, A Catholic Quest for the Holy Grail. I'm sorry, was that a plug? I talk about 5 Eucharistic miracles in the past 25 years, wherein the bread turned to flesh and the blood to wine. These were the results of Novus Ordo Masses. Now, what does that tell us? It tells us that the new Mass can, in fact, confect the sacraments. So that tells us something about the new Mass itself. Now, that doesn't mean that the new Mass is not uniquely open to abuses, that it lacks a lot of the ceremonies that brought particular graces of the new Mass, of the Old Mass rather, the Tridentine Mass, that it does not express nearly as clearly the truth of what the Church teaches is going on as the traditional Mass does. It's not saying any of that. All it's saying is that it gets the job done. But if that's true, given the age of the priests involved, they were ordained using the new rites. So we have to make the same presumption.
About the Holy Orders.
Because if the Holy Orders, if the new rite of ordination was intrinsically invalid, then they wouldn't be real priests. It wouldn't matter if they said the Tridentine Mass. If the Novus Ordo was intrinsically invalid, then the bread and wine wouldn't change, and you would not have Eucharistic miracles. It just wouldn't happen.
Yeah.
So, I would say that that is a direct message from heaven regarding the new rites. Does that mean I prefer them? No. Does that mean that we don't need the traditional rites? No. Does that mean that the new rites have not caused all kinds of damage in their way? No. But what it does mean is that they are not intrinsically invalid, and that at the end of the day they will get the job done when said with, just like anything else, proper intention, proper matter, proper form. But then again, if you said the Tridentine Mass with improper matter, with invalid matter, or invalid intention, you wouldn't get anything out of it. So.
Okay. Next question is from Milagros Jimenez. I was born in Cuba but grew up in Spain, and most of my ancestry is Spaniard. I also consider myself a monarchist and a devout Catholic who adheres to classic Spanish traditions. Charles, can you give me your take on the Cuban independence from Spain, as I imagine the history books always paint the Spaniards as the bad guys and the Church as oppressive?
Yes, I certainly can. If you go to Key West, Florida, it may take you a little while because of Hurricane Irma's damage to the Keys.
Yeah.
But if you can make your way down there at some point in the future, and go to the cemetery, you will see a section of the cemetery with the inscription Heroes of the Revolution in Espanol. And these are Cuban revolutionaries against Spain who were buried in Key West. What will impress you is the Masonic symbolism everywhere, because it is a Masonic section of the cemetery. They have a Catholic section, but that's not where these guys are buried. Now, it's important to bear in mind that in the 19th century, first Spain, and Cuba was affected by it. Spain was racked by a series of civil wars called the Carlist Wars. These were a struggle between the older line of the House of Bourbon and their supporters, the Carlists, against the younger line. But as is always the case with these things, it was not simply a civil war between two branches of the family. It wasn't just Game of Thrones. It was also a question of ideology, because the Carlists wanted the traditional Spanish monarchy with the church in predominant place, a real king ruling as well as reigning, and local liberties, the fueros, Now, as you know, before the Carlist Wars, which started in the 1830s, Spain had lost most of her empire in the Americas, but not all. She held on to siempre leal Cuba, always loyal Cuba. Puerto Rico, the Philippines, Guam, and the Marianas. So she still had a little bit of an empire. In Cuba, to support the Carlists, a very famous newspaper was founded back in the 1830s and stayed in the hands of the same family until the 1950s, in 1959, when Castro closed it down. And this was called El Diario de la Marina. And it was it took me a little bit of searching to remember the name of the thing, but I did. And it was not only conservative, but actually sort of Carlist, all through its history, down to 59. In recent years, it's been revived by exiles. I don't know if it has any connection to the original family, but you can see the new edition online. You can also see the old ones online. There were three parties in Cuba over the course of the 19th century. The revolutionaries who wanted an independent republic or annexation to the United States. The autonomous, who wanted Cuba to be, you guessed it, autonomous, but still under the Spanish crown. And then those who were simply royalists who wanted Spain to stay, Cuba to stay closely connected to Spain. The Cuban revolutionaries were Masonic in their inspiration, but the liberal regime of Spain did finally come to an accommodation in 1897, whereby Cuba would have an autonomous status within the Spanish Empire. And this was on the very verge of the Spanish-American War. The Americans were keen on ejecting Spain entirely from the New World. And they did. And of course, without that, I doubt the Spanish would have been ejected from Cuba, the Philippines, and Puerto Rico. It was interesting that my boyhood confessor, my youthful confessor, I should say, in my youth, not his, was James Francis Cardinal McIntyre. And Cardinal McIntyre was the former Archbishop of LA when I knew him. One of the defining moments of his life was when he was 12 years old, and this country went to war with Spain in 1898. And the Irish priest preached as a Holy Crusade from the pulpit. But the young Jim McIntyre thought, how's that possible that it's a Holy Crusade? We're going at the behest of our Protestant government to fight a Catholic country. That always bothered him. And many, many years later, when Francisco Franco presented him with the Order of Isabella the Catholic, he told me that he just wished the priest who preached that sermon could have been present for the ceremony. So at any rate, that's the thing. I mean, Spain has suffered a great deal from anti-Catholicism of her foreign enemies, first England and then the United States, but also of her internal enemies, the liberals and then the Spanish Republicans, and now, of course, the dominant set that runs Spain today. It's a tragedy, it's criminal, but there it is.
Okay. Our last question today is from superfan Mark Williams.
Oh boy, okay.
Yeah. In the historical Holy Roman Empire, power was very decentralized, and the Holy Roman Emperor had quite a job to do to keep everything in line. How did the Holy Roman Emperors enforce their decrees in such a decentralized state? Why are there so few, if none at all, cases of the nobles getting together and just overthrowing the emperor as soon as they were dissatisfied? Is my understanding of the empire as a decentralized state accurate?
Yes, it is. And to answer your question, during the Middle Ages, the only way that the emperor was able to enforce his rule, ultimately, is if a nobleman went too far against the law, then the emperor would put him under the ban of the empire, which basically meant that any of his neighbors who felt strong enough to take his lands could.
Wow, that'll do it.
That'll do it. But the maintenance of the emperor's law was like the king's peace in the rest of Europe. It was something that everyone agreed on. We've had this question before in other ways, but for instance, in medieval Europe, if somebody was playing the robber on the king's highway, then the locals would, in England anyway, raise the hue and cry, and they'd go out to get him.
Wow.
And having gotten him, they would say that the king's peace was restored.
Ah.
And this notion of the peace, the king's peace or the emperor's peace, which if you broke, you would be declared in the empire under the ban. In the rest of Europe, you would be an outlaw, outside the law, meaning that any man who could take you down was welcome to. That's because the notion of the peace was very strong, and it was not obviously bound up with immediate enforcement, because the authorities didn't have any means of enforcing the peace. The locals did.
Mm-hmm.
And they knew that if they took to arms to enforce the king's peace, they had the king's blessing. But that's a very different setup from us. With us, we do anything we can get away with that the cops don't catch up with us on.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that our neighbors and ourselves are bound to uphold the peace, that's very, very different.
Yeah.
But notice that we still have remnants of it in law.
We have neighborhood watch.
Which is a little bit like it.
Yeah.
We have the justice of the peace.
What is that exactly?
Well, it comes from medieval England, but the justice of the peace was a judge. Someone breaks the peace, you bring him up before the justice of the peace, and it's his job to mobilize locals to enforce the peace.
Ah.
But also, if there's a dispute between you and your neighbor, one of you can swear out get a warrant sworn out to force your neighbor to keep the peace.
Okay.
Or you could be accused of disturbing the peace. Have you heard these phrases in law?
Yeah, I have.
Well, they're all ancient, and they go back to the medieval monarchy.
Yeah.
Disturbing the peace meant disturbing the king's peace.
I see.
Keeping the peace.
I've heard that.
Was keeping the king's peace.
Yeah.
But the peace, which we just use now, it's just a ceremonial phrase in law.
Yeah.
But it was a real, living, vital thing.
Yeah.
To our medieval ancestors, and in the Holy Roman Empire, which later on, as the other nations of Europe centralized, the Holy Roman Empire fell apart because it did not. It decentralized, if anything, even further. And the Reformation put paid to it. Although it managed to limp along, thanks to the Habsburgs having power that was not dependent purely on their authority as emperors. Nevertheless, yeah, that was...
So basically, empires never collapsed via internal fracturing.
Well, it did.
Or do they?
But it took... Well, they do. But in the case of the Holy Roman Empire, it really took the Protestant revolt.
And that did it. That was a nail in the coffin.
Yeah, but it still limped on for 2 centuries.
Okay.
They had to come through some very odd ways of doing it. So, for instance, the emperor was elected, but by the time of the Reformation and afterwards, he was always elected from the House of Habsburg. So it was quasi-hereditary, but they still went through the form of the election.
Okay.
But part of the imperial coronation, which was a big deal, which was no longer a coronation in Rome, only in Germany. Charles V was the last emperor to be crowned by the Pope. But before an emperor was crowned by the Pope, he would be crowned King of the Germans, initially in Aachen and then later in Frankfurt.
Mm.
Before that, he had to be elected. So the King of the Germans was elected emperor, and then would go to Rome to be crowned. That was the medieval thing. And often that was brought up with all sorts of problems, because inevitably the Italian peninsula would be in chaos. So he wants to get crowned at Rome, which means he has to take an army to restore order long enough to get the crown.
Italian peninsula always seems to be in chaos.
Yeah, that's the Italian way. You wouldn't understand that not being Italian, but
of course.
Just think of your Italian relatives yelling at each other. Now multiply that by a whole country.
That's pretty scary.
Yeah, well, you know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Yeah. Notice how much easier your Hungarian and Slovak cousins were?
Yeah, they're very laid back.
Yeah. Aren't they just... Oh, by the way, this is for the lady. I want you to see this. All right. Anyway,
Wow.
what?
Okay.
I can be relaxed. So, she was also thought I'd had a heavy meal
Yeah.
for that. Just so you know, today's an Ember Day. I've had an almond croissant. That's it. I'll have a bigger meal later, but just so you know. Anyway, I don't know why I'm paying so much attention to her, but
and if Charles sounds a little different today, it's because he's probably getting sick. So cut him a little slack, yeah?
yeah, boy, is sick and starving.
Yeah.
That doesn't sound good.
Yeah.
That we're almost at the end.
Thank God.
All right, but let's get on to the end. So, as I was saying, at the coronation, they had to make some sort of a deal after the Reformation with the Protestant electors. Okay, because some of them were Protestants.
Mm-hmm.
Now, like every coronation rite, a mass was a big part of the proceedings. So the Protestant electors would walk out, and they'd come back after the mass was over.
Oh, okay.
Well, this kind
Yeah.
it kind of wrecks the whole point.
Yeah.
But that was what they were forced to do.
They didn't need to walk out.
Well, yeah, they did, because they didn't want to be present at the idolatrous mass. And even if they didn't care about it personally, their subjects did. And it was up to them to uphold the Protestant church. Although, and this is another one of the funny things that happened after the Reformation, not one, not two, not three, but 4 Catholic monarchs were heads of Protestant churches.
Okay. What? Wow.
King James II was the head of the Protestant Church of England. He was Catholic. After the Saxon kings converted to Catholicism in the 1730s, they were still the heads of their state church. The kings of Bavaria became the head of their Protestant church after 1815, and so did the Emperor of Austria.
And their subjects like that? Like, even though...
It wasn't a question of liking it, it was to prevent greater evil and greater... See, after the end of the 30 Years' War, Germany was tired of religious war. So they came to all kinds of accommodations from the local level up to the national. You had in different areas, depending on how the thing had worked out in that area.
Okay.
You had churches that were used by both denominations. The Catholics use it for Mass at one time on Sunday, and the Lutherans or the Calvinists on another, have a service at another time.
Did they have statues of Mary and St. Joseph?
Yeah, but they veiled them.
They veiled them?
No. Well, see, the alternative was to continue fighting.
Yeah, okay, and nobody wanted that.
Nobody wanted that, and there was no question of indifferentism because everybody knew who was Catholic and who was Protestant. Another thing that occurred, not in England, but in Germany, you had monasteries of nuns and a couple of monks that went Protestant and stayed that way up until the present day.
Okay.
So you had Protestant nuns and Protestant monks, which makes no sense.
Right.
But why should it?
Okay.
Life is like that. Remember, ladies and gentlemen, you've heard me say this time and again. It doesn't have to make sense. Once you understand that, you'll understand your neighbor a lot better. You'll understand the times you live in and the society you live in a lot better. And at the end of the day, you'll understand yourself a lot better. That's a terrible thought.
Okay, that's it for this episode. If you enjoyed listening to Charles, remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you'd like to send Charles a question, you could do so through the Tumblr House website. See you next time.
Take care, God bless, and remember, next time is Michaelmas, so be angelic.